Right, so this is a paper on Tibetan longevity practices, subtitled The Body and Buddhist Tantric Ritual. So one of the issues which I come to really more at the end, though in a sense quite a bit of what happens in the course of the paper is building up to that, is the question of what sort of body is being posited or imagined in these practices. Is it a Western kind of a biomedical kind of body? Is it something else? And if it's something else, what does that mean? Tibetan longevity practices, as you might imagine, are directed towards the attainment of a long and healthy life. There are some striking similarities with Chinese self-cultivation, inner alchemy, Taoist practices, Yangsheng, Neda, kind of thing we've been talking about here. These include things like the internal structure of channels within the body, the use of specific dietary practices, and there are parallels to the kind of thing which Gil was talking about just now, in fact, physical exercises. And there are possible, or I think I would probably say probable, connections to a partly shared Indian and Chinese culture of alchemical practice here, using alchemy in a fairly wide sense. However, while Chinese practices mostly work within a Taoist framework, Tibetan practices are very, to the extent that is that they have a religious or spiritual framework at all. As we learned yesterday, or as we heard yesterday, some don't necessarily to a very great degree. Tibetan practices are all very clearly Vajrayana Buddhist, Tantric Buddhist, and closely integrated with the Vajrayana path to Buddhahood. You don't seek a long and healthy life for its own sake, at least normatively in the texts. You seek this purely because it enables you to practice longer towards the achievement of Buddhahood, to work further towards helping other sentient beings, and so on. And as you'll see also when I come on to some of the details of the ritual framework within which at least one set of these practices can be performed, there are constant reminders that this is all about Buddhahood. Longevity is a secondary issue. And this is one reason, I think, why these practices have received much less attention from Tibetanists and scholars of Tibetan studies than they perhaps should have had, given their importance within Tibetan society. People have tended to focus on the Buddhahood end of this, and they've assumed that things like longevity practice are as secondary as the texts tend to present them as. They're certainly quite important within Tibetan culture and Tibetan society. So for the last 3 years I've been directing a 3-year project based, so it's just coming to an end in fact this month, based at Cardiff University, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and looking at one particular set of Tibetan longevity practices, the Chime Sogtik cycle of practices, which is most closely associated with the late Dujong Rinpoche, though it actually wasn't initially created by him. Chime Sogtik meaning something like immortal essence of life. And this is a team project. It involved myself, Kathy Campbell and Rob Mayer, who are both researchers and textual scholars on the project. And my primary expertise is in anthropology. 2 lamas were involved as consultants on the project. You'll see a little bit of one of them later in the PowerPoint, Lama Kunsang Dorje, who mostly lives in Bhutan these days, and Barbara Gurkha, who's going to be speaking immediately after me, who was also researching longevity over the same period. I was one of her supervisors for her DPhil, and there were quite close connections between her two and the project. So at that stage, we did some of the research in Kalimpong at Barbara's International Trust for Traditional Medicine. The Chime Sogtik is a terma teaching, which in Tibetan parlance implies that it is a kind of a revelation whose origins are traced back to Guru Padmasambhava, the primary guru of the Nyingmapa tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. And the general idea is that these practices were taught by Padmasambhava in his lifetime to his disciples. Those disciples were then reborn again and again in subsequent generations and remembered and retaught the teachings in forms that were appropriate to the particular time in which they lived. This particular cycle was revealed by this Lama whose picture you can see here, Silna Nanke Dorje, Tibetan Lama, it was revealed in eastern Bhutan in 1904. So this is quite a modern cycle, but the kind of practices these are ones that one can trace back very much to, certainly to the 12th, 13th century. Similar Namkha Dorje, the Tibetan often just reveals the outlines of the practice and then passes it on to lamas who become the guardians and have authority for the teachings and who elaborate them and build up the body of texts and liturgical practices and so on associated with them. Silna Namkha Dorje first passed this authority on to the 15th Gyalwa Karmapa, a very important early 20th century Lama in eastern Tibet, who wrote some of the basic texts. The Gyalwa Karmapa died in 1922, and Silna Namkha Dorje passed it on again to Dudjom Rinpoche, another very well-known 20th century Lama, considerably younger. He was quite young at this time. This is a picture of him at the end of his life. And Dudjom Rinpoche wrote most of the other ritual and liturgical texts. It became one of his principal practices and was taught widely to his many disciples. Dudjom Rinpoche left Tibet in 1958, a little before most of the refugees left, and settled in Kalimpong, where he founded a monastery. He lived there to 1975, moved to Nepal, died there in 1987. Dudjom Rinpoche's health was quite poor for quite a lot of his life. He had emphysema, among other things, and he attributed the fact that he lived as long as he did to his practice of Chime Sogtik. There are various points in his life where the obstacles were predicted, his death was predicted, and he lived longer as a result of the practice, in his view. The Chime Sogtik practices centre around the longevity deity Guru Amitayus, who you can see here. This deity represents Amitayus with female consort as realised by Guru Padmasambhava and his consort Mandarava at a legendary episode when they were said to have achieved power over longevity at this cave of Maratika, which is now usually identified with a cave in Nepal, though its probable location, to the extent it had a physical location, was perhaps somewhere else. This is a wall painting in a second monastery in Kalimpong that's also very much involved with this practice and with Dudjom Rinpoche's teachings. And that's the wall painting as a whole. And as you can see, there are quite a number of other figures around the central figures. The ones at the top are lamas of the lineage, including Dudjom Rinpoche and Silna Namkha Dorje. The ones at the bottom are protective deities, and I'll go on to talk about the others in a little more detail. Firstly, you can see that the two figures immediately above the central figure, and these represent higher aspects of the central figure, as it were. The central figure, Guru Amitayus, is, in a sense, the physical manifestation which the longevity deity, which took place of the longevity deity through the activity of Padmasambhava and his consort. The figure above is this is the three kaya scheme, which is very well known in Tibetan Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism more generally. The figure above is a kind of celestial, visionary, more abstract version, manifestation, from which can be seen as the source from which the physical manifestation emanated. The figure above that, Guru Amitabha, is the here is the figure of the Dharmakaya, of the ultimate Buddha principle from which that emanated. So already in this visualization, you get this referral straight back to the essence of Buddhahood and enlightenment. And this is part of what I meant by saying that there are constant structural reminders within the practice of this being really a practice about Buddhahood and enlightenment, and only secondarily about longevity. Longevity is very clearly framed here as being a power of the Buddha, an aspect of the Buddha, something that derives is connected with your practice towards Buddhahood. These four surrounding figures are Buddha figures corresponding to the four directions. So you might notice, referring back to the previous paper, that we in fact have a pentad, a set of 5 figures associated with the centre and 4 directions, and I think one could lead the comparisons quite a bit further there, although there's also I think quite a long distance in time and space between Gill's material and the material we're talking about here. There are, I think, historical connections and philosophical and connections at the level of ideas too. 4 objects which aren't shown in this particular picture are 4 symbolic objects which act as supports of various aspects of the life force. And the life force tends to be analysed in terms of a set of quantities which are seen as being strengthened by the practice. In the Chimesogchik there are 4 of these. You get 3 or 5 or different numbers and different sets and different long life practices. Life duration, these are very rough translations. Life force, life spirit or life energy, breath. Those of you who are interested in more about this, I'll refer you to Barbara's forthcoming book, in which she's got a lot of information about these. And each of these is supported in this particular practice by a symbolic object. I've just listed those on the PowerPoint. Something's gone a bit wrong with the Tibetan there, Yungdrung, the swastika. The remainder of the mandala consists of 6 goddesses of sensory enjoyment, 8 offering goddesses, and 4 doorkeeper goddesses who themselves have male consorts. The imagery here is quite strongly feminized, and I would say also quite strongly sexualized, but that's not something I'm going to go into a great deal of detail of in this presentation. But I think it is quite a significant part of much long life practice. Now that was a kind of view of the mandala from in front, in 3 dimensions, as it were, in the air before you, in space before you. This is actually the same thing seen in 2 dimensions. This is actually a sun mandala made as part of a ritual. And in this version, the Sanskrit syllable at the centre is where the main deity would be, with the Sambhogakaya and Dharmakaya versions, in a sense, above in space towards you. And you can see the surrounding lotus petals with dots representing the places of the various deities. And on this, actually, the 4 supports are marked on the intermediate directions in the first circle out. It's a fairly traditional Tibetan mandala structure. And that's just showing you the main deities and the various circles of objects. So that's all at a fairly abstract level. A little bit about who does the practice. It can be performed alone by a solitary practitioner in retreat or on a regular basis, say as part of a regular daily practice. It can be performed by a group, in which case there'll be a number of other people taking on central roles. There'll normally be a lama in charge. There'll be a couple of ritual assistants. There may be a separate chant leader and a number of people joining in the chanting. In that case, it's seen as important that at least one person has the expertise to carry out the visualizations properly and empower them properly. Normally that would be the lama at the center. And as always in Tibetan Tantric practice, there is an expectation that all who are doing the practice will have received appropriate empowerments, which are in a sense permissions to undertake the practice. But another way in which this can be done is as a life empowerment, in which the long life energy, as it were, is being accumulated for the benefit of other people, typically for a community of lay people. So a monastery may do this. This is in fact what was going on in the ritual I'll talk about in a little while in Kalimpong, in part to empower a whole series of ritual substances, liquids and pills, which are then given to lay people who come along and queue up to receive these, and which transmits the long life blessing to them. The basic structure is given in the main ritual manual. I mean, there are about 20 or 30 texts in the corpus which fit together in fairly complex ways, and I'm not going to go into much detail about that now. I'll just say a little bit. But the main ritual manual gives, as it were, the central structure of the ritual. And if you look at that, the opening section, the introductory sequence, refuge and bodhicitta verses and so on, are standard opening sequences more or less of any tantric ritual sequence in Tibet. The wording would vary, the detail, the principle, however, is very much the same. they again start with a kind of affirmation of Buddhahood as being what all this is about. You then move into the main practice, a dissolution of conventional reality. This links to the whole Mahayana idea about relative and absolute truth, shunyata, whatever. The visualization, generation of the deity and the mandala surrounding. So you're now visualizing yourself as the main deity at the center of the mandala. The invitation of the deities into the mandala. So there's a kind of dual process here in which you visualize and then you invite in offerings and praises to the deities. Four stages of mantra recitation with different mantras. And this process can include Salung practice. These are breathing exercises which can involve an ingesting of essences from the universe of a somewhat related kind to what we were talking about before, a request to the deities for the siddhis, the power over long life, and then a sequence called the Tseguk, in which the various deities of the mandala are asked to summon in from the surrounding mandala, from the surrounding universe, the lost life force of the practitioner. There's this idea of life force as deteriorating and being lost. In a way, it's an idea that has a lot in common with the shamanic idea of the lost soul and the recovery of soul substance. But there is also the Tseguk also includes the ingestion of the Amrita Dutsi, which is the positive essence of the transfigured universe. So there are kind of two sides to this process. There is a loss which is being repaired, but there is also an ingestion of a positive essence, a sense of a kind of essential juice, as it were, of the universe. The Tibetan term chu translates rasa in Sanskrit as well at this point, which is being drawn in and fed in. So the universe here is taking on a kind of a nurturing role towards the practitioners. And then you get a dissolution, a sealing of what's been brought in, a dissolution of the mandala, and a fairly standard set of concluding practices. Now that corresponds roughly to C in this diagram. All this is meant to show here is that you can have very short versions of this and you can have much longer and more elaborate ones. The right-hand column shows how this might be configured as one day of a 7-day ritual, such as the one which I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of in Kalimpong, where the practice is being repeated over and over again. And clearly this is a pretty complex technical operation, whereas at the other end, in the very short practice, you might just have one person sitting in a cave or a room and just doing this at an almost entirely internal visualization level. So this is the monastery in Kalimpong where we were able to take part and document and study a performance of the 7-day version of this back in March, and Lama Kunsang Dorje, who I mentioned before. In this case, this is the beginning process and the preparation of pills which are being empowered during the ritual and which are going to be distributed towards the end of it. That's the San Mandala actually that you saw before being made. And this is the layout of the temple. The San Mandala now is inside that kind of coloured cube thing you can see in the centre with those elaborate offerings, the torma in front of it, and the pills are above the mandala. And during the ritual, in a sense, all of the energy that is being summoned, I use energy obviously in a kind of rather metaphorical sense there, is actually being directed towards empowering those pills and a series of vases containing liquids in the enclosure. So Lama presiding sequence where the deities are being externalized in the form of mass dancers that dance in the temple and are being directed by the Lama and so on. So this is a pretty elaborate and dramatic and sophisticated thing which, as you gather, goes on quite a long way. So this is the most elaborate way in which the practice could be done. As I said, at the simplest way, and you could just have a solitary practitioner doing a much more condensed version. And finally, to come to this question of the body, which in a sense is what I'm working towards in this. The body here, I would say, in Western terms, is very clearly not just the physical body. You could say, to start with, that it's the body-mind complex, including what one could call psychological aspects, emotions, feelings, motivational states, as well as cognitive aspects. The whole point of this repetition and redundancy of doing this practice over and over again is to create a kind of different vision of the universe which starts to gain its own reality and conviction as against ordinary reality. The focus in the particular version of the practice I've been talking about here is primarily, in fact, on these emotional and cognitive aspects, but there are physiological aspects too. There are breathing and dietary practices, Chulen practices. Barbara will be talking about Chulen in her paper and ways in which it's entered into the contemporary commercial context. There are physical exercises. There are the contents of the pills themselves, which are not in fact arbitrary. They're believed to have health-giving properties. But I would say that the key transaction here is one in which the experience world is being transformed over and over again from a source of danger, somewhere to which one's life energy is being constantly lost, into a source of regeneration and support. If you look at this in relation to biomedicine, I think you can see it as doing something which is complementary to the primary emphases of biomedicine, and also I would say complementary to the primary emphases of traditional Tibetan and Bhutanese medicine, and Sowa Rigpa, which tend to emphasize pharmacological and other physiological interventions. The Chime Sogtik works only very secondarily with pills and substances that might have a physiological effect. It works primarily with imagery and feeling. And I think in terms of some of the recent Western writing on the placebo, I think you say some of Merman's work, it could be seen as a very sophisticated way of operating with what Western medicine refers to as the placebo effect. Now, whether it works and how much it works is another set of questions. And again, I would share Gil's interest in how do you start dealing with those sorts of issues. I think they're very significant issues. But what I would say is that to make sense of what's supposed to be going on here at all in Western terms, we have to move to a much more open model of the body-mind, in which not only are we prepared to drop boundaries between body and mind and see them as a single field, in which the material and physiological feeling, emotion, experience are all included. But we also need to dissolve the boundary between the individual and the surrounding environment. And of course, within Buddhist philosophy, and Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, that's a very normative thing to do ultimately anyway. But I think it's something which in a sense is presupposed by the explanatory model of the ritual, and which I think is we also need to take fairly seriously if we want to try to find a Western scientific model within which we could make sense of this kind of process. So that's it.
Thanks very much, Geoffrey.